Hey friends, Kevin here, and today we're talking about Buford Pusser. Is he a hero or is he a villain? Now, if you're new to this channel, I've done a lot of videos you may be interested in where I go to the real places. The real places that all of these things concerning Buford Pusser and his wife Pauline happen. The cemetery, the house, the courthouse where he worked, the jail that was used at the time, the actual road where all of these things happened, where this ambush happened. And if you've been following the news, you know that recently they did an exhumation on Pauline Pusser. Hopefully to answer, finally, once and for all, a lot of questions about what actually happened to her that day in 1967. And I'm going to run through all of this, and I'm going to try to play devil's advocate a little bit and just basically put the facts out there. But I do want your opinions on these different points. Put these down in the comments. Let's all share this stuff and see where we stand on it. Because right now, at this very moment, no one knows. And like I said, there are two very distinct camps with everything to do with Buford Pusser. There are the people who feel that he could do no wrong and is an American legend, and the town where he lived, you know, they have a big festival every year. And then there's that other side that thinks he wasn't that good of a man, was involved in different illegal things, and possibly had something to do with the death of his wife. One of these two camps is going to be very, very unhappy when the results of this new investigation comes out. And I honestly don't know which camp it's going to be. And that's what makes this such an interesting story. Now, here's what we do know from this exhumation that was done on February the 8th. One of the reasons it was done was because an autopsy was not done in 1967. So there may still be evidence on her body. They can look at angles of trajectory. It's possible with an autopsy being done that there's actually one of the shots still inside of her. Is it possible there would be something under her fingernails? There are all sorts of different scenarios that can play out with this, and of course that information hasn't been put out there yet. One of the things I found interesting is that this comment keeps being made that this is with the permission of her family. I don't know who that is because I've never seen that stated in any of these news stories from the last week or so. Because she had two children before she and Buford married, and then they had a child together, and all three of those are now deceased. So I don't know who in her family gave this blessing. And I'm going to try to hit on some different points here. Some you may have heard before, some I think will be a new angle to this, which is why I want your comments down below. Now, you're going to hear a lot about the TBI, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. That wasn't what it was called in 1967. As a matter of fact, at that time, it was the Tennessee Bureau of Criminal Identification. So Buford Pusser being born, he grows up there, he graduates, and he chooses to go to the United States Marine Corps. He doesn't make it through training in the United States Marine Corps because of asthma. Generally, those things are found and dealt with before someone proceeds on into military training. But again, this was the late 50s. I think most veterans, however, would tell you that anyone that really wants to stay in will find a way to stay in. And someone that doesn't want to be in there has decided really quickly that it is not for them, that they don't like being yelled at and the structure and the other things going on with it. They are looking for a reason to get out. And that very, very seldom happens because the government already has an investment. They really don't want to let people out. So that always struck me as odd because he couldn't finish military training because of asthma, but the next thing he does is basically become a semi-pro wrestler, which is how he ends up in Chicago and meets his wife. A couple years later, they get married, and they end up coming back to Adamsville, Tennessee. Now, his wife, Pauline, is actually from Virginia, around the Hayside, Virginia area, which is another rural area. It is nowhere near that part of Tennessee. It's probably 400 miles away, but the size of the towns and things are fairly similar. So I can see why she was comfortable being in that area of Tennessee. Now, despite what the movie portrays, his father was already involved in law enforcement. So he ends up back in Adamsville, the town, being a constable and basically the town sheriff, whatever they choose to call it in that area. This is what he's doing basically from 1962 to 1964. In 1964, he runs for sheriff of McNairy County because the previous sheriff had been killed in an automobile accident. So these are 2-year terms. At that time in Tennessee, you could run 3 times for these 2-year terms. And apparently, from something I found out today, these are consecutive terms. I thought it was that total in a lifetime, but apparently at that time it was consecutive terms, which is why Buford was the sheriff of McNairy County from 1964 to 1970. 6 years, 3 2-year terms. But it's interesting that he chose to keep running with some of the things that happened, kind of a timeline. One thing you need to keep in mind is this is not like it was today. I know where I live, they may hire someone, bring them in to be a police officer, let them do a few dinky little things, but after a few months, if it looks like they're going to go for this, if they are going to be a full-time employee, they are sent to a police academy for training, weapons training, driving training, and more than anything else, actually learning the law. That's one of the things that was not done in that previous era, the era that Buford would have come in there with, that you could do these things and not actually have any police training. So here's some of the timeline that's interesting to me. He's elected in 1964. In 1966 is the thing with Louise Hathcock, where she's attempting supposedly to kill him. He ends up killing her. And after all this, he runs for re-election. Now, he's been stabbed several times up to this point. So he is re-elected in 1966. In the early part of 1967, there's an assassination attempt on him where he is shot 3 times by an unknown assailant. August of 67 is when this whole incident happens. The ambush, his wife is killed, he's shot, all of these scenarios play out. And yet the next year is an election year and he runs again. And this is interesting to me for this reason. Sheriffs, police officers, were not well paid in that era. They certainly aren't paid today anywhere near what they deserve, but at least it is a pretty decent wage. In these rural areas back in the 60s and 70s, these people didn't get paid very well. So in that era, why do you want to keep running, keep being elected sheriff? Because honestly, you could have made as much money working down behind the counter at the hardware store. Now this ambush that happened on New Hope Road, and again I have a video of this on the channel, if you're not familiar with this area, this will make this make a whole lot more sense. As he's going out on a call early in the morning before daylight, his wife decides to go with him. You know, this is a really happy thing according to the movie. One of the things that comes back into play with this is supposedly they were having marital problems and had a big fight the day before. So why she would have gotten up and agreed to go with him to the other end of the county rather than stay home is one of those parts that's up for debate depending on which camp you are in. hero, villain. Now, I know a lot of people question why he took that back road. People take back roads for all kinds of reasons. I take back roads, side roads, a lot of times rather than a more traveled main road. So that isn't a big deal for me in trying to form an opinion on this. But the fact is, there were several ways he could have gone. And one of the questions that's always been is, if this was a setup, how did the assassins know which route he was going to be taking? To be able to hide behind the church and wait for him to come by still before daylight and know it was his car, although it did have sheriff tags on it. From where they were sitting, they probably would not have been able to see that, especially in the nighttime before daylight, in the early dawn, because unlike cars now, everything didn't have lights shining on the plates, especially front plates, in 1967. So how would they have known this was the right vehicle to take chase and get into this horrific shooting battle 3/4 of a mile down the road? Is it possible? Yes. Is it possible it didn't go down that way? Yes. Which is why there are two very divided camps on this issue. Supposedly he ends up going to the left, they're coming around on the right when they fire into the car the first time. One of the questions someone asked on a previous thing I did is it possible that he accidentally, trying to shoot back? According to him, he did not shoot back in all of this. So that, according to his statement, that eliminates any chance of he accidentally did this. But it was a very good question that someone brought up. And then, of course, he pulls over a couple miles down the road to check on her, and these people catch back up with him. Now there's another little battle. And then those people leave and depart. He goes on down this country road, which now merges in to the main road that will go back to Selmer, which is where he works, which is the county seat for McNairy County, which is quite a ways when, if you needed help, which he eventually did stop somewhere and find something open to be able to get help there. But if he had turned in the other directions, he is just a couple of miles away from Corinth, Mississippi, which is a large town compared to other things around there. At that time, his little town only had a population of about 1,000 people. The town he lived in, Adamsville. That whole county had a population of about 18,000. Corinth, Mississippi, that town alone had about 12,000 people at that time. So would have had more restaurants, more likely that gas stations and things would have been open, certainly a good hospital. So that's one of the speculation things that goes on with these camps too, is why did he go this way instead of going this way? But someone that's just been in something this traumatic doesn't always make the right decision. So you're injured, she's injured, maybe you're already aware that she's gone. He didn't want to go into Mississippi because that opens up a whole other can of worms, so he's more confident in trying to get back to his people, his sheriff's department. No one's really going to ever know what he was really thinking, why he made the choice he did of which direction to go for help. So I don't think anyone can base their own theory on what he did proving their way or disproving the other way. I'd like to hear your opinions on this. And I love reading all the comments from everyone, and most of them are great. You know, But there's a lot of people out there that, depending on where they live, they don't understand how things worked in rural areas in the 60s and 70s. Those of us that lived in that area kind of get it, you know, if we grew up in one of those areas, because law enforcement was different from place to place. There really weren't a lot of set rules. You know, for investigation, even with bringing the state in, I have zero doubt that the state of Tennessee did the best they could at that time. They have a victim that is a sheriff's wife. They have a sheriff that's seriously injured. But again, they had nothing to go by as far as the technology and things that we have today are things that they just could not have dreamed of in that era. Really, the only thing you have is fingerprints in that era now, and some shells. Now there's so much more you can do with shells and shell casings. You have DNA as a possibility. You have blood splatter as a possibility that people are experts in now that they were not in that era. So all sorts of different things that they will be able to potentially do now that could not have been done then, and not because the investigators, the state of Tennessee, local authorities, it's not because any of those didn't try or were trying to cover things up. It's just they didn't have the ability at that time. And if you're an old geezer like me, you understand that, but I think a lot of younger people who are catching on to this case don't quite have an understanding of how primitive the investigation techniques were still even at that time. But let me know your thoughts. Certainly, if you haven't been to that area, check out the videos I have on this channel of all of these places that have to do with the Buford Pusser story, because it will give you a good feel, a good idea of how things really worked out. There's some little maps and things in there, because it's so much different. The reality is very different from the Hollywoodized Walking Tall movies. I hope sometime in the very near future we finally get some answers from these investigations and find out which one of these two camps is going to be happy and which one of these two camps is going to be very unhappy